Today, Saturday 13th, is for me personally a bitter and upsetting day. I know it's a bitterness and distress that's shared by many people. The news that has precipitated this is the confirmation of the death of Gonzalo Lira in a Ukrainian prison or hospital. I'm not quite sure which. Now, Gonzalo and I have knew each other for a fair amount of time. We began contacts actually before the latest iteration of the Ukrainian conflict began. We did programs together. I appeared on his shows, and of course, he joined us many times on the Duran. He was an exuberant, vital, exceptionally clever, remarkable man, and he's someone that I developed very real feelings of affection for. In earlier programs, I have spoken of him as a friend, and that is what he was. That doesn't mean that he and I always saw eye to eye on everything. It's also the case that he could be emotional and could sometimes say things which were perhaps went further than was wise and perhaps even he intended. But as I've said many times, the fact that people have passion, emotion, it just means ultimately that they're vibrant personalities. And in Gonzalo's case, I actually have to say this, I think a heroic one, because he remained in Ukraine. He did so, and I know there's been a huge amount of speculation as to why he chose to remain in Ukraine, but the explanation is very simple. Gonzalo did not want it to be widely disclosed and talked about. He was, in fact, a private man. But anyway, the explanation was very simple. His two children were in Ukraine, aged 10 and 7. There was immense difficulties arranging to have them brought out of Ukraine, and as a father, he wanted to be close to them as possible. And as a father myself, I absolutely understand those feelings. Now, a person in his position who chose to stay in the Ukraine might have decided to lie low, but that was never Gonzalo's nature. He saw the situation in Ukraine. He was deeply distressed by the situation in Ukraine, and he felt a moral obligation to speak out about it. And he did. And he did that exercising his right as an American citizen under the First Amendment of the Constitution to report his thoughts and set out his opinions, and he did that on an American platform, principally, that platform being, of course, YouTube. Now, I have singled out all of this, the fact that he was an American citizen, that he was exercising the rights American citizens have of free speech, and that he was doing it on an American-owned platform, which was YouTube, because again, there's been a huge amount of debate and discussion about why Gonzalo spoke out in the way that he did. He spoke out in the way that he did because he loved Ukraine, and I think this is a point very few people seem to understand, but he loved Ukraine. He had his family there, he had his children there. He traveled extensively around the country. He knew the people. He liked the people. He was deeply distressed about what was happening in Ukraine itself. He loved Ukraine. He was very upset and very angry about some of the things that were happening in Ukraine, and also about the policies followed by Western governments. And he felt that it was his moral duty to speak out, and he felt that it was his right as an American citizen to speak out and to do so, as I said, on an American platform, which is YouTube. Well, the sequel, everyone now knows. He was arrested. He was arrested twice, by the way. On the second occasion, he was held in detention. He basically disappeared from view. It was very, very difficult establishing contact with him. Eventually, that is to say, we at the Duran, contacted by his father, and that provided us with a, well, short last few days, a kind of indirect line of communication with Gonzalo. As people also know, he was released briefly from prison. He spoke about the extraordinary mistreatment that he faced in prison. He spoke about his increasingly grave medical conditions. He tried to leave Ukraine and to enter Hungary, but he was unsuccessful. He said that if that failed, if he was not able to leave Ukraine and enter Hungary, he faced a real prospect of dying in detention, and I'm afraid, tragically, that is what has now happened. Now, there's an awful lot more that can be said, but I will say a few things. Firstly, I feel I've lost a friend. This has been extremely distressing for me personally. It's also distressing for Alex Christoforou, my colleague, who had actually more contacts with Gonzalo than I did. I feel deeply distraught by this news, and I'm afraid it is probably going to make my work a little less coherent, at least for a couple of days, as I try to get over this experience. I should also say that part of that distress extends not just to Gonzalo himself, to the terrible ordeal he went through, culminating in his death, but also, of course, for his family, his two young children, who I am sure will remember him with love and pride as the heroic individual that he was. Beyond that, however, I will express a certain sense of anger. Gonzalo, as I said, was an American citizen. He was expressing opinions, in English, by the way, on an American platform, which was YouTube. He was arrested for doing so by the Ukrainian authorities. I have discussed the case that was brought against him. It never made any kind of sense to me at all, and notice that at no point in time was it ever properly prosecuted. There has never been, to my knowledge, a proper hearing in a Ukrainian court where the issues in his case have been fully argued out. Certainly, there has never been anything remotely like a trial. So, he was held in detention in Ukraine for, as I said, talking in English, principally to people in the United States, as an American citizen. He had a lawyer selected for the court, by the court for him. I'm not, by the way, in any way denying the ability of this lawyer. Everything I've heard about him suggests that he did everything that he could on Gonzalo's behalf. He was given very limited contact with the outside world. He was barely able to communicate with his family. And his descriptions of his treatment in prison, despite his known health conditions, were of a sort that I am not going to describe. Now, I can't help but feel that his own government, the United States government, whose duty it is to protect the citizens of the United States, essentially abandoned him. The enormous influence the United States has in Ukraine is hardly a topic a controversial topic. Everybody acknowledges it. The American government might not have been happy with some of the things Gonzalo was saying, but again, let me reiterate, all he was doing was exercising his constitutional right as an American citizen of free speech, safeguarded by the First Amendment of the Constitution. The case that was brought against him made no sense at all, and he had well-known health conditions, and there were, shall we say, very strong grounds to be concerned about his mistreatment. Everything that I know about this case points to the American government having failed to take the steps that were needed to get Gonzalo to a safe place, to extend to him the protection of the United States, which would have been decisive. Now, others have attempted to intervene on his behalf. We at the Duran attempted it to the limited extent that we can. Others, like Elon Musk, for example, contacted people in Washington. I understand Rand Paul and others, Ron Paul perhaps also, spoke out on his behalf. His case was brought up by Congress people in Washington, and yet a wall of indifference, or at least silence, a stony silence in response to all of this from the State Department. And I should say from the part of many people in Congress as well. And the media in the United States, so powerful as it is, the fourth estate, as it sometimes calls itself, well, basically they said nothing about him. I mean, I believe there were the odd pieces here and there, but you can't find anything substantial about him. The contrast with the attention that other prisoners in similar circumstances, the attention they receive from the American media when the American media feels engaged in their cases and in their causes, could not be more stark. Now, to me, that is a terrible statement about the politics, the situation today in the United States. The government owes the same duty to all its citizens. It shouldn't pick and choose which citizens it works to protect. Some governments, of course, do, but that is not what one expects from the government of the United States. The same applies to the media as well. One would expect that the media, which after all, its rights too are protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution, it would be particularly concerned about action being taken against an American citizen exercising his First Amendment rights. Apparently not. Now, as I said, I feel angry. There's a lot more I can say about this. I'm not going to do so. I don't like to express myself in unduly emotional terms, so I'm not going to do that further. One last thing I'm going to say before I move on to the topics of this program is that I have been inundated by messages from people, some including many people I know, about Gonzalo. I should say that I am frankly too emotionally involved at the moment to be able to respond to them. I am generally distressed by this affair, but I have received comfort from the fact that all of these people have been writing, and I know that his family are receiving that same comfort as well. He may have been abandoned by his government, but he was not abandoned by many, many others. Anyway, that is all I will say about Gonzalo, except to say that I hope that now he rests in peace. Let me now move on to the remainder of the topics of this particular program. And yesterday, I discussed the fact that the United States had done that which I always felt it was completely wrong for it to do. It started missile strikes on the Houthis. I will continue to refer to them as the Houthis, the militia, this powerful militia in Yemen, which has been launching attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, and by the way, also launching the occasional missile towards Israel. None of those missiles, by the way, has got through. Anyway, the United States launched its bombing strikes and its missile strikes, as did Britain. I'm not going to go into the details of these strikes. Suffice to say that the Houthis insist that no significant damage was done to their facilities, and certainly no damage that would deter them from continuing to do what they are doing in the Red Sea. In fact, they're saying that they're going to escalate their attacks in the Red Sea, and they are also now going to start targeting American and British warships. I have some skepticism about whether they're really in a position to cause serious damage to American warships. About British warships, I am not so sure. But anyway, that was yesterday. Then today, I've seen more reports that there were further missile strikes by the United States on Houthi positions in Yemen, apparently radar stations and such things, though I gather overall that they were done on a smaller scale. And the immediate reaction in the markets and amongst the shipping community been entirely predictable, far from being reassured by these American missile strikes. The ship owners have decided that it is even more dangerous now to operate in the Red Sea than it was before. It is now becoming a war zone, so they're giving instructions to ships not to transit through the Red Sea. And the price of oil has slipped up, and there's talk also that other goods that travel through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal to Europe, that they're going to become more expensive as well. Obviously, this is an immediate response to a strike. It could be, if this strike actually is more successful than I expect, if the Houthis do indeed rein in their attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, it could be that if ship owners come to believe that the actual crisis is indeed over and that the missile strikes have achieved their intended purpose, it could be that all of this will reverse and the shipping will return to the Red Sea, and this operation against the Houthis will have been seen to be successful. And, that is a possibility. I'm not going to argue that it is not. I don't have direct information about what these strikes have achieved. But of course, the Houthis are saying the opposite. As I discussed yesterday, they're a battle-hardened and extremely tough militia. They've absorbed many missile and bomb strikes in the past, launched against them by the Saudis and their supported coalition, backed by the United States. The Houthis were able to fight the Saudis to a standstill, and the Houthis have experience of absorbing bombing and missile strikes, and that's what they say they've done with these, and they say that they're going to escalate their attacks on the shipping in the Red Sea. And for the moment at least, I have no reason to disbelieve them. It is consistent with what has happened with the Houthis in the past. Which, of course, brings us back to the question that I was asking in my program yesterday, which is, what really is this strike intended to achieve? Now, Larry Johnson of Sonar 21, one of the best blogs, by the way, altogether on geopolitical matters, Larry Johnson being, of course, a former veteran, well, he is a veteran of the CIA and a member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, one of the best remaining institutions left in the United States. Anyway, Larry Johnson was very kindly passed on to me an article by Stephen Bryan in Asia Times, and I read it through, and Stephen Bryan provides us with a kind of explanation for these strikes. He points out that all these warships that are there in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the Gulf of Oman, they're incredibly expensive keeping them there. And the Houthis, when they launch their attacks on the commercial shipping in the Red Sea, they're able to do so using drones and light rockets and missiles and things of that kind, which basically cost only a few $1,000s. Whereas the Aegis missiles that the Aegis class destroyers that the US Navy has deployed to the area, the analogous, I believe they're French actually, missiles that the British destroyers also have to use, well, they each of them costs multi-million dollars a piece. And ships have, of course, limited arsenals of missiles. They can't operate indefinitely. If the Houthis launch dozens of drones and dozens of rockets, and the United States and the British use their Aegis missiles and their other missiles to shoot all these drones and rockets down, well, sooner or later, they're going to start running out of missiles. And of course, the financial bill is going to become absolutely astronomical. So the entire military operation to protect the commercial shipping in the Red Sea is ultimately unsustainable. And that became increasingly obvious to the leadership in Washington and London. And for that reason, they took the decision that they had no real option but to launch these missile strikes on the Houthis, on their bases, in what looks like an effort to try to interrupt the attacks from their source. I have to say, this comes across to me as rather desperate. I'm sure this is exactly what people in Washington especially have been saying to each other. But given, as I said, what we know about the Houthis, their ability to absorb damage and all of that, and the fact that this is a very tough organization and the industrial facilities that they put together, I mean, is it really a solution to launch hundreds more of very expensive missiles at the Houthis and hope that spending tens of billions of dollars in one big missile strike is going to be more successful than shooting down Houthi drones and rockets with missiles that cost, well, a couple of $1 million a piece? Now, I don't think so. And it points to the way in which the United States and its allies are now, in effect, in a blind alley with this affair. Because They can go on launching rockets and missiles at the Houthis, as I said, clocking up huge costs, financial costs. The Houthis can go on attacking merchant shipping in the Red Sea. And assuming Houthi resilience, which I accept is an assumption, this is going to go on indefinitely, and the costs for the US are simply going to grow. And of course, with the area becoming a war zone, well, we've seen how the shippers have already reacted. They're keeping their ships away, which appears to defeat the whole point of the exercise. Now, I've already made very clear what I think the United States should have done. Not now or over the last few weeks, but over an extended period, which is that they should have worked towards establishing a ceasefire in Gaza. I've also stressed again, I'm not suggesting an unconditional ceasefire, but a ceasefire which the Arab states might be motivated to support and which would provide the United States with the necessary diplomatic leverage to, say, speak to the Iranians and get the Iranians to talk to the Houthis to call all these problems in the Red Sea off. Now that, for me, remains far and away the optimal approach to this problem. It's only a start. Much more would need to be done to stabilize the situation in the Middle East. But for the record, I think if the United States had acted in that way, its prestige and reputation in the Middle East, far from being damaged, would instead have been enhanced. People would have said in the Middle East, this is an intelligent, thoughtful American government. It's taking the right steps. It's doing the right things. People would not have said that the United States is weak. This obsession with not appearing to be weak merely leads to situations like the one we're seeing in the Red Sea now, when it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that sooner or later, if things continue as they are, the United States will indeed be seen to be weak. Anyway, that was my preferred choice. But actually, thinking about it overnight, I actually think there was another one as well. And that is that the United States, way back when the Houthis started to attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea, they could have done a proper cost-benefit calculation. They could have said to themselves, it's simply doesn't make financial sense to keep powerful US warships off the coast of Yemen trying to protect commercial ships. We can't resolve this problem that way. We don't want to seek a ceasefire in Gaza. Well, there is a third thing we could have done, and that is that we could have told the ship owners, Red Sea area is now dangerous, avoid the Red Sea. Don't use the Suez Canal. Now, there is a lot of mythology about the Suez Canal and its importance to the world economy, and it is indeed the case that a huge amount of world trade passes through it. But what people perhaps are not aware of or have forgotten is that there was a period of around a decade in the late 1960s and early and 1970s when the Suez Canal was actually closed. The Egyptian government took the decision to close the canal following its defeat by Israel in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and the Suez Canal, as I said, for around a decade, actually remained closed. And that didn't cause world trade to collapse. Ships simply went to their destinations, avoiding the Suez Canal, and the Red Sea. They went, if they were coming from the Pacific and they were heading for Europe and the Mediterranean, well, they would simply went round the Cape of Good Hope. They circumnavigated Africa as people once upon a time, the explorers once did. And yes, it added some days to the journey. It caused some things to be perhaps more expensive than they might otherwise have been. But the world economy, much smaller in those days, much less diversified in those days, was able to absorb it. And of course, if we're talking about the vast Asia-Pacific trade, the trade, say, between China and Japan and the United States, well, that doesn't pass through the Red Sea or the Suez Canal at all. It goes through, why would it? It goes across the Pacific from the Asian ports directly to the American ones on the west coast of the United States. And that has, of course, grown to a much greater extent than was the case in the 60s and 70s. So why not take that course? Call the Houthis bluff. Say to them, look, you want to close the Red Sea, that's up to you. We're not going to change our policy because of what you are doing. All you're doing is you're exposing yourselves as a rogue player, engaging in piracy on the high seas. Well, we're not going to run after you, waste our time, our valuable ships, our valuable warships, which have more important things to do. And, of course, the ship owners might have needed some time to sort out their arrangements, and there might have been some costs, but Western governments could have helped them with those costs, surely, quite plausibly, given that we're talking about only a finite amount of time until trade patterns readjust. The cost of helping the ship owners to readjust to these changes, perhaps some of the end consumers of some of these goods as well, quite plausibly it would have been, well, not that much more expensive than what the United States is currently doing, keeping its ships marooned in the Red Sea. Anyway, that's, as I said, the solution which I suspect an earlier generation, a stronger-minded generation of American leaders would have followed. The reason it's not being done today is because with this astonishing belligerence that we have seen develop within the West, and also this obsession with not losing face, apparently, or my guess is, nobody has given any serious thought to it. There we are. Now, in my program yesterday, I said that the logical endpoint to which this is going to lead is an American strike on Iran. And I had some pushback from that. Some people said that attacking Iran for the United States is far too dangerous. It's problematic. The Iranians are in a much stronger position than they have ever been. All of which is true, by the way. And I, again, am going to ask the rhetorical question. When have any of those calculations deterred people of neocon views who are so prominent today in Washington? As far as I can see, they never have. If you read articles written by people like John Bolton, for example, who is ceaselessly advocating strikes on Iran, none of these calculations, none of these things that rational people make, which say, don't strike at Iran, none of these rational calculations seem to bother them. I understand that there was, for example, a moment about 2 decades ago when the United States did come very close to attacking North Korea. Lots of people say, this is not a good idea at all. The Chinese were bound to respond to it. The North Koreans themselves have strong defenses, all that kind of thing. But apparently, the United States came much closer to attacking North Korea than most people are aware. And I suspect it's the same with Iran. I suspect that there have been moments over the last 20 years when we've probably been quite close to an attack on Iran, and there will be people who are going out demanding such an attack now. Lieutenant Colonel Wilkinson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff and advisor, did a program with Glenn Deason and myself, which you can find on the Duran, in which he discussed how difficult it is to talk to the advocates of this kind of policy, these kind of missile strikes, how difficult it is to argue with them, how fraught the discussions tend to become. And of course, if you are an administration seeking re-election, you also know something else, that these people have their contacts in the media, that if they don't get the missile strikes that they crave for, they'll start planting stories in the media about how weak and dithery the decision-making in Washington has become. And by the way, there are already lots and lots of articles like this all over the media in the United States and, by the way, in Britain now. So I think that people are far too sanguine about this. I think that, as I said, the logical endpoint of any escalation in the Middle East, unless the United States suddenly reverses and decides to back off, which I don't see this administration doing, the logical endpoint, if you start escalating in the way that has just been done, is to strike at Iran. And sure enough, we see more comments to this effect from the British government, whose role in this affair I discussed yesterday, and which, as a British citizen, I find profoundly, deeply frustrating. But anyway, we've had comments from Grant Shapps. He's come along and he said, he's come along and said that the strikes on the Houthis are a message to Iran. This is, of course, exactly what the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, said yesterday, and now we see the British Defence Secretary, Mr. Shapps, saying the same. You must get this is the message to Iran, and he says this in an interview. This is his message, the message that the British and the Americans supposedly are sending to Iran. You must get the Houthi rebels, others who are acting as proxies for you. Lebanese Hezbollah are obvious examples, and some in Iraq and Syria. You must get these different organizations to cease and desist. Wonderful legal language taken from the US legal system, by the way. To cease and desist, because the world is running out of patience. We see you. This is about Iran, mind you, he's talking about Iran. We see you. We see through what you are doing. We see how you are doing it, particularly the Houthi rebels, and no good can come from it. So, the Iranians have been warned by Grant Shapps, by the British government. And I've no doubt that in giving these warnings, and the British have been in close liaison with the Americans apparently are angry with the British because the British spent so much time talking about these missile strikes with each other before the missile strikes actually happened. The news of the missile strikes leaked out to the media, leaked out before the Americans wanted it to. But anyway, we must assume, there's no reason to doubt, that what Lord Cameron is saying, what Grant Shapps is saying, mirrors the opinions of at least some powerful people in Washington. Note that no one in Washington has come forward and said, well, you know, Lord Cameron and Grant Shapps, they're talking nonsense. This isn't really what this is all about. I mean, there have been people who say the United States doesn't want a war in Yemen. Reassuring words, but how much weight are we to place on them, given that the president himself has said that he's prepared to do the same thing all over again? But anyway, we haven't seen anybody in Washington really come out and say that Lord Cameron and Grant Shapps are talking out of turn. And the Iranians listening to all of this, they will be saying to themselves, the British and the Americans, the British in particular, saying, you know, don't do this, because if you do, then what exactly? What exactly is Grant Shapps talking about when he says that we, and then he goes on to say the world, though it is absolutely clear that Britain and the United States do not speak for the world, but this is axiomatically what Western leaders do. We are running out of patience. Well, I think that the Iranians will say to themselves, this could be a bluff, but we have to take our precautions. We have to prepare our defenses, because even though we are not really afraid of these attacks, which are being threatened against us, we have to consider the possibility that they might come. And when people make those kind of calculations, we are closer to the point when a war happens. So, let me repeat again. I think people are being too sanguine about the risks of a strike on Iran. I think that we are now in another escalator. Whatever some people in Washington and London may think, once you climb on to an escalator like this, it is extremely difficult to get off, and the end point, as I said, the logical end point of this kind of pattern of escalation is a strike on Iran. I hope I'm wrong. I hope some people, as I said, in Washington do find the strength of will to say no and stop. But again, going back to what Lieutenant Colonel Wilkerson said, we know how difficult that is, the enormous political risks that those who say stop always feel that they are taking on, and at a time when the president himself is, shall we say, fragile, and probably viscerally shares this desire for a pugilistic style of foreign policy, and when the Secretary of Defense is severely ill, who can be confident that these missile strikes on Iran won't happen? I certainly am not. Anyway, we will see. There's been a passionate debate about all of this. By the way, I believe it's still ongoing in the UN Security Council. We'll see where it leads. Now, one of the interesting things about this particular missile strike is that it took attention away from the fact that last night, early this morning, the Russians launched another huge missile strike on Ukraine. Now, I'm not exactly sure how many missiles were involved. I sense it was around 50. But anyway, a big missile strike did take place. And the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with its own very brief, very terse account. In the morning, this is latest intelligence, the latest Russian Ministry of Defense briefing. In the morning, the Russian armed forces delivered a group strike by high-precision, long-range sea and air-based weapons, including Kinzhal hypersonic air-launched ballistic missiles, as well as unmanned aerial vehicles at Ukrainian military-industrial complex facilities, producing 155, 152, and 125 millimeter shells, gunpowder, and unmanned vehicles. The goal of the strike has been achieved. All the assigned targets have been engaged. Now, I'm not sure how big this particular strike was. My sense is that about 50 missiles took part, and the Ukrainians again are acknowledging that all of the Kinzhal missiles that were launched got through. They were unable to shoot down a single one. The Russians also apparently launched at least some of the giant Kh-32 missiles launched by the Tupolev 22M3 bombers. They got through as well. Ballistic missiles of various types were also used. They too got through. The Russians say that sea and air-based weapons were used. So it does look as if Kalibr missiles, subsonic cruise missiles, were launched from the Black Sea by Russian Navy warships, and I think it's a certainty that Kh-101 subsonic cruise missiles were launched by Russian ships, by Russian aircraft, by Tupolev, Russian aircraft, Tupolev 95 bombers. As I said, it's early days, early hours. We don't yet know the full impact of the strike. And of course, Geranium-2 drones also participated. But again, one gets the sense that the air defense system, the Ukrainian air defense system, proved completely unequal to the challenge of this particular strike. So there we go. So that's one other thing that has happened overnight. Looking at the media in Britain today, it's fascinating to see how this latest Russian missile strike is receiving almost no attention, as all the focus is on what the Americans are doing in Yemen. And that, by the way, must be very concerning for Ukraine, because the Ukrainians, in order to prevail in this war, as they hope, what they need more than anything else is to keep Western attention focused upon them. If the United States has clambered onto an escalatory escalator with respect to the situation in the Middle East, if the United States' efforts and attention is now going to be focused on the Middle East, if it's moving inexorably towards a clash with Iran, then frankly, Ukraine will have lost much of the attention that it has received up to this point, and it's even less likely to get much of the military equipment and technology that it needs. So, big Russian missile strike on Ukraine. As I said, I will wait to get more information about its effects before I discuss those in any detail. There's one little point I do want quickly to make, however. I've noticed that some Western officials are conflating the Kh-101 subsonic missile launched by the Tupolev 95 bombers with the Kalibr missile launched by the Russian Navy ships. And they seem to assume that these are variants of the same cruise missile. Now, it is correct that both the KH-101 and the Calibre are subsonic cruise missiles that use turbojet engines, but they are in fact entirely different missiles. They have different design philosophies. The KH-101 is the more sophisticated of the two missiles, so far as I can see. It's more stealthy and more maneuverable, and it has shown that it is able to launch rounds, things to divert attacks upon itself. Let's just say, Calibres did participate in this strike. I suspect the largest number of missiles used were KH-101s, but supersonic missiles and ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles were used as well, and all of the missiles in the latter category appear to have got through and appear to be doing enormous damage. Now, there's also been a fair amount of news from the Ukrainian battlefronts, and it's increasingly looking as if the Russians, having captured Marinka, are now well on the way to capturing Georgievka, this village to the west of Marinka, and it seems that once they capture Georgievka, they will be well on the way to advancing towards Kurakovo, a rather bigger place apparently, but one which is the main logistical hub, holding together the communications and the transport links, which have enabled the Ukrainians to keep their forces in Vuhledar, for example, supplied. So this is an important development if the Russians are able to develop it. And there's also been considerable more reporting about the situation in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. The Russians apparently again have been making further advances in this area. The two Ukrainian brigades that are in this area, Bradley Square, are suffering very heavy pressure. And there's also reports that the Russians are making significant progress both in Pervomaisky, a village to the southwest of Avdiivka, but also in Stepovoye, to the northwest of Avdiivka, and along the railway as well. So fighting continuing in all of these places, but with the Russians making particular progress in Pervomaisky and gradually moving forward with their operations in that area too. Now, and by the way, lastly, some reports about the Russians making significant progress in the Bakhmut area also. Well, we've had interesting reports about all of this, the situation on the Ukrainian front lines in the New York Times. And it says that Russia regains upper hand in Ukraine's east as Kiev's troops struggle. And it admits that the Russians having defeated, of course they never use the word defeat, defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the summer, are now on the attack. They say Russian troops are on the attack, especially in the country's east. The town of Marinka has all but fallen, which is not true. It actually has fallen. It fell some time ago. Avdiivka is being slowly encircled. A push on Chasiv Yar near Bakhmut is expected. Further north, outside Kupiansk, the fighting has barely slowed since the fall. And the article then has Michael Kaufman, a regular commentator about military matters, denying that the situation is catastrophic. He says the Russian advantage at this stage is not decisive, but the war is not a stalemate. And he does float the possibility that if the Ukrainians are fully re-equipped by the West, they might be able to go back on the offensive in 2025. Difficult, though, I have to say. I find that to believe. So that's the New York Times. And we've also had certain comments about the way in which what I call aggressive attrition that the Russians are conducting is beginning to have an effect on Ukraine. And the commentary here came from our old friend, Hanna Maliar, who used to be an official in Ukraine's defense ministry. She was basically sacked some weeks ago. She's again engages in occasional commentary. One must assume, I do assume, that she still has her contacts within the defense ministry, and they're able to keep her informed, or reasonably well informed, about the situation on the battlefronts. Anyway, Hanna Maliar basically admits that this attrition is starting to take its toll, that the Russians are able to go on exerting pressure all the time, and that the Ukrainians are suffering losses, and that they're outnumbered in every place and on every front line, and that this is ultimately becoming an extremely difficult situation. So Hanna Maliar, in effect, acknowledging the fact of the effect, rather, of aggressive attrition by the Russians. Anyway, that's Hanna Maliar, but of course, hope springs eternal, and it's increasingly clear that some Ukrainians, there's even a piece about this in Strana, are now telling each other that let's not despair. We still are able to keep the Russians at bay. FPV drones are the way we're going to do it. We have far better FPV drones than the Russians do. We have more of them. We have better operators. We're able to hold the Russians at bay. And FPV drones are a substitute for the fact that the Russians have so much more artillery than we do. By the way, Hanna Maliar clearly takes a different view, because she actually spoke about the enormous effect that the Russians have in terms of artillery. Now, let me repeat again the point that I made yesterday. It is absolutely the case that FPV drones are causing the Russians real problems as they creep forward on the battlefronts. But let me also again repeat that what we're seeing at the moment, what the Russians are doing at the moment, is not a general offensive. Relatively small forces have so far been committed to the battlefronts. When we see troops move, we see them move in company strength, usually even less than that at any one time, and small groups of armored vehicles, not really a big, strong general offensive, which is consistent, as I said before, with the fact that the Russians currently are engaged in aggressive attrition. Now, we're also getting lots of reports about how the Russians are building up their forces. And by the way, there's now been many pictures coming out of the Russian military-industrial complex showing us the whole vast array of precision-guided bombs that the Russians are developing and are churning out in ever greater numbers, and which they will no doubt be using more aggressively soon on the battlefronts. But it is inconceivable that the Russians are not also working hard on a solution to the problem of Ukrainian FPV drones. And probably the major focus is jamming the control of these drones, interfering with any AI systems that eventually are installed to replace the controllers. The Russians, there's been reports on Russian sites that the Russians anticipate that Ukraine will be using many more drones over the next couple of months. The Russians are certain to be working to find counters to this. And they found counters to pretty much every Ukrainian weapon up to now. For example, the HIMARS, when it was deployed in the summer of 2022, briefly appeared to be fairly effective. And for some weeks and months, the Russians had difficulties countering it. And then gradually they were able to jam its systems, something which, by the way, I remember reading when the HIMARS was first deployed, that would be impossible. Well, the Russians found how to do it. And steadily we see that the HIMARS has become less and less effective. And note how the Western media no longer talks about it anymore. And the same has been true with the Storm Shadows. Then there was the drone offensive that Ukraine launched against the Russian cities, Moscow and all of the others. That has petered out as the Russians again have found means to counter those long-range drones. So they will find means to counter these FPV drones. And they're probably working on doing that now, even as they prepare for the offensive which is to come. They're also working on preparing for other things. I've discussed in several programs how the US government and the British government seem to have all but decided that the time has come to seize, steal if you prefer, the frozen assets of the Russians that are in the West, principally in Europe. And by the way, there's two bills put forward by Congress people in both the House and the Senate authorizing the US government to seize these assets. Well, the Russians are now apparently preparing their legal defenses to this. They've apparently in the process of instructing lawyers to contest any confiscation moves. I say call them confiscation moves. Let's stick with these euphemisms for the moment. The Russians have had difficulty finding law firms in the West that are prepared to act for them. But I suspect that any claim that the Russians bring will be to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and that might not actually need the big Western international law firms. Probably you could put together a pretty impressive legal team, not just from Russia, but from other countries outside the West as well. So we'll see how that all turns out. And of course, we have news about the economic situation in the West. It seems that in the United States, the budget deficit in 2023 came to $500 billion. $500 billion against $36 billion, which is the budget deficit in Russia. Obviously, these are economies on entirely different scales. The Eurozone is now, I think, largely acknowledged to be in recession. No real sign of that easing off at any time. Chancellor Scholz continues to blame Putin for Germany's economic problems and suggests that it was the Russians who cut off energy to Germany. I wonder how many people in Germany actually truly believe that. And of course, farmers are protesting in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in other places. So things are becoming more difficult. And one piece of news that came through today suggests that before very long, they might become more difficult still. Because the ruling party has won the presidential elections in Taiwan, as I personally expected it would do. The new president is apparently even more committed to eventual Taiwanese independence, secession, as the Chinese government would say, than the previous president was. The United States, the Biden administration, has increasingly become committed to supporting this independence drive, even as they pretend to the Chinese that they intend otherwise. And it's very difficult for me to see how the Chinese government will be able to ignore for much longer these moves being taken by Taiwan, or by the leadership in Taiwan, and by the United States. Now, I read somewhere that a conflict in Taiwan would cause massive disruption to economic linkages and supply chains, and would shave $10 trillion from the global economy, which is a huge proportion of the global economy, certainly more than enough to hurl us all into a deep depression. You would have expected, again, that political leaders in the West would be working overtime to make it clear to Taiwan that independence moves are not supported by the West. Nothing like that, of course, is going on. We continue to drift along, pursuing increasingly belligerent, confrontational policies. No end to any of that in sight, even as in the West things turn out worst for us. Now, I'm going to finish with an article by my old friend, Simon Tisdall, in The Guardian. He's, as I've said many times, a committed neocon in his own way. I mean, he was somebody who, back in 2022, was urging that the United States and the NATO declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Anyway, Simon Tisdall, hardly a moderate, therefore, he now says that the US isn't the biggest power in the Middle East anymore, Iran is. And then he goes to explain how American mistakes, errors have placed Iran in a winning position. Well, I'm not sure that that is really true, but it is undoubtedly the case that American policy has led to a collapse in American credibility in the Middle East, and that Iran has been the biggest beneficiary. And Simon Tisdall also makes the point that Iran has been the biggest beneficiary of the Gaza crisis, about which I also agree. I think this is becoming increasingly obvious. Even he, as a neocon, can see it. And yet, is anybody suggesting alternatives? What we get instead is Grant Shapps giving his messages to the Iranians. We see you, we see through what you're doing, we see how you're doing it, and no good can come from it. While we have policymakers who think and talk like that, things can only get worse. Well, that's my program for today. As I said, I'm sorry if I was a bit emotional about the death of Gonzalo Lira. my friend. We might eventually say more about this on the Duran, but this is where I finish my program for today. Thank you for joining me. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Remember to check out our shop, where we have all sorts of amazing things that you can find: t-shirts, hats, hoodies, magic mugs, other amazing things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.